What's up guys, welcome back to Silicon Tech. Now in the last video I gave an introduction to the hardware revisions of the new MacBook Pros that were released a couple of weeks ago. So I spoke about the brand new screens, the new sound system, the battery life, as well as the old but new ports that Apple brought back. So I want you to check that video out if you haven't. But today I want to talk about what I'm really excited about, and that's the new chips. And yes, that's chips with an S. Now, we all knew that Apple were releasing these new MacBook Pros, but everybody kind of figured that they would be releasing one new version of the M1 chip. So if we go back to last year, the M1 chip that Apple released in the MacBook Air, 13-inch MacBook Pro, and Mac Mini was a very powerful chip, but Apple admitted that it was the efficiency chip. So even though people are getting great results from this chip, just in their workflows of whatever editing that they were doing, creating videos, consuming media, like the chip was a beast and definitely putting a lot of the competition to shame. But when you think about it in that it was the efficiency chip, your mind just exploded with all of the possibilities of them building on this architecture. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How did they build on this architecture? But not with one chip, with two. So when Apple unveiled these new MacBook Pros, of course they had to unveil the new chipsets. I, for one, thought they were going to come out with one new chip. So when they announced the M1 Pro, I was very satisfied. They were building on the architecture of the M1. So now we're seeing one version of this M1 Pro chip with 10 CPU cores and 16 GPU cores. And just with that, it's a lot. Now, come to find now, after the presentation, there are actually 3 versions of the M1 Pro chip. So let's just start off at baseline. At baseline, the bottom of the barrel Bend M1 Pro chip that you can pick up is an 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, 16-core neural engine. Now I'll make this disclaimer about the neural engine at the beginning of this video so I don't have to kind of bring it up again. All of these chips, whether it's the M1 Pro and the later M1 Max, are going to have a 16-core neural engine, so that doesn't change. 16-core for literally everything. Now when you look at the base model of this chip, it's really impressive. It's an 8-core CPU, but hey, you may think the original M1 also had an 8-core CPU. Now the difference between those 8 cores is that on the original M1, 4 of those cores were high efficiency cores and the other 4 were for kind of low efficiency tasks, so whether it's like web browsing or if you're on Instagram, any social media, things like that. Now on this baseline M1 Pro, 6 of those cores are high efficiency cores and the other 2 are for low efficiency tasks. So just with that one change, even on the base model of this chip, could take that CPU bounds over the original M1. And then you get the increased baseline on all of these chips at 14 cores from the GPU standpoint, which is 6 cores over the max GPU on any of the M1 chips because they were capped off at 8 GPU cores. So a lot of the performance in these chips, as you'll see as we get further in the video, is from GPU performance. So the notch up from the baseline on the M1 Pro is the 10-core CPU, 14-core GPU that you could find. Now, the 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, and 10-core CPU, 14-core GPU, those chips are exclusive to the 14-inch, so you can't get them on the 16-inch, which is kind of a reverse because in the past with MacBook Pros, you're always able to get the more powerful version of whatever Intel chip on the 16-inch, and that was exclusive to that, so you couldn't get it on the 13-inch. Now it's kind of like a complete reversal because you get the less powerful chips on the smaller version of the MacBook Pro. So it's just kind of a 180 flip in that regard, so I thought that was interesting. And speaking of the 16-inch, now the baseline and only M1 Pro chip you can get on the 16-inch is the 10-core CPU, 16-core GPU. So you can get that one on the 14-inch, but as I mentioned, it is the only chip, the only M1 Pro chip that you'll find on the 16-inch version of the MacBook Pro. So yeah, even when we look at it just from an M1 Pro standpoint, the fact that you can get the 10 CPU cores and the 16-core GPU, so doubling the count of the original M1 from the 8 GPU cores is insane. So when you think about that, that's twice the performance from a GPU standpoint. And you may think about why isn't the CPU cores upgraded or more increased like within the CPU cores instead of just the 10. But a lot of the things that professionals will be using these machines for is very GPU intensive. So whether it's video editing or photo editing, those rely highly on the GPU just in terms of the time you can get to export the videos, the amount of effects you can use on the videos, and everything of that nature. And speaking of export times and just video intensive editing tasks, within the new M1 Pro chip is also a dedicated video encoder, so you get 2 of those, and that'll help cut down just the amount of time that you are spending exporting videos. So once you get all your edits done and you're trying to basically get the machine to sew all of that up and make it all nice and neat for you, you'll see a decrease in time if you've worked on an M1 machine and definitely like the Intel base version Max. And now to the biggest surprise for a lot of people is the M1 Max chip. And this thing is insane. So as I mentioned before, the M1 Max chip, which is essentially the most powerful chip that you can get on any of these machines or just a laptop in general, it's not exclusive to the 16-inch anymore. So you can get this on the 14-inch if you choose. Now, with this M1 Max comes 10-core CPU, 24-core GPU, up to a 32-core GPU. That's insane. You can literally quadruple the amount of GPU performance on the original M1 chip. So you just think about that. Now, from a professional standpoint, to use this power is going to require a lot, not just your simple video editing or photo editing. So you can still get this chip if you choose, regardless of what you do. It's gonna cost you a pretty penny, but if you want the latest and greatest chip in your machine, you have every right to do that. But to really push these chips to the max is gonna take a lot of things and a lot of professional things to really be able to get a return of investment on that and to be comfortable with that return of investment that you want. So you're definitely using this machine as a real legitimate tool to push forward work that you may have with different clients and things of that nature. But let's get into the chip. Yes, this chip is powerful. As I said, it can cap off at a 32-core GPU. But let's bring into account the RAM. And I forgot to mention this on the M1 Pro, but with the M1 Pro chips, if you choose any of those versions of those chips, they start off at a baseline of 16 gigabytes of RAM and can max out at 32 gigabytes of RAM. But when you come to the M1 Max chips, those start off at the 32 gigabytes of RAM and can go up to an insane 64 gigabytes of RAM. And like I mentioned with the GPU core count, the amount of unified memory, so not just any RAM, but unified memory, this RAM being on a chip and the CPU, GPU being allowed to access it, as unified, being a free-for-all, is insane. So you can have 64 gigabytes of this unified memory. Now, what type of projects you would have to do to utilize this memory, as well as the minimum 24 GPU core count on the Max, I don't know. I know I'm not capable of it, but like I said, I don't doubt anybody that's picking up this machine knowing what they want to use it for, or if they don't even use it for, the high power intensive tasks, you know, they at least have a sense of security if this machine won't be outdated for any time soon, and they can have it for years and have the ability to build on it. Now, some people may not be doing certain tasks now, but they may see, hey, a year from now, 2 years from now, I plan to be doing these things. And a lot of people don't want to pick up a machine that's only capable for what they do now. They want that headroom. They want that ability to sometimes even be encouraged to do more because their machine can do more. So I think these machines would be utilized in a lot of ways that we haven't seen on a traditional laptop to this point. But what's doing all these high powered tasks on if you don't have the storage to utilize it? So with all of these machines, you have these upgraded SSDs coming from Apple that start off at a minimum of 512 gigabytes and can go all the way up to 8 gigabytes of SSD storage. That's crazy. Realistically, for me, I would say 2 is more than enough for on-device. Many people, especially when you're kind of out and about using different machines, people rely on portable SSDs. So having up to 8 gigabytes of SSD storage on one device that you essentially can't move around like that if you need different devices for different things, it's crazy. Even with editing the 4K video, 8K video, it should have a lot of headroom for you to be good if you chose not to use external SSD, which I don't know why or what would allow you to not do that, but hey, to each his own. So there's a lot of options between these devices. So if you're in the market for getting the new MacBook Pro, you have a choice between 2 chips, between 3 options of RAM with 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, between 512 gigabytes of storage to 8 terabytes of storage, and of course the screen sizes, the 16-inch and the 14-inch. So Apple seems to have a lot of things covered when it comes to the chips, the RAM, screen size, of course, and the SSDs. So at least there's some interesting combinations. I'm interested to see how people spec these out. So not only how they spec them out, but kind of the reasoning of why they're specing them out, how they're specing them out. So what their workflow requires and things of that nature. But it could be a gift and a curse. But one thing that will regulate these choices for a lot of people is the price. But I'll take a deeper dive into the price on the next video. If you have any questions about anything, definitely let me know in the comments. Like the video. If you like the video, consider subscribing to the channel, and catch you on the next one. Peace.